everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome to Ask an Expert series. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Barb Trailer, and I'm the director of the Wooden Boat Festival, and I'm also the host of the Ask an Expert series. So we have a real treat for you tonight. We will be talking to Susan Shillinglaw and Chris Chase from the Western Flyer Foundation. So Professor Shillinglaw has been teaching and writing about Steinbeck for 27 years. She's the director of the Center for Steinbeck Study for 18 years. She has written several books about Steinbeck, recently Carol and John Steinbeck, A Portrait of a Marriage, and Reading the Grapes of Wrath, a journey into Steinbeck's California, as well as several other publications and essays. Currently, she's co-editing an encyclopedia of cultural history and working on a study of Steinbeck in Russia. We're so grateful to have you here with us tonight, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Barb. I'm delighted to be invited. I wish I were in Port Townsend, but we all probably, wish we could be in Port Townsend, but thank you so much. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the background of John Steinbeck's and Ed Ricketts' trip to the Sea of Cortez. So I'm going to fill in some of the stories of why they took the trip and who went with them and what it means. That's how it's certainly related to the wooden boat they took to the Sea of Cortez in 1940. So I have a lot of pictures, so I'll show you pictures, but please ask me questions as I'm going along, and I'll try to integrate them into my talk. Okay, so here we go. Okay, this is my favorite cover of the Sea of Cortez because it makes the whole voyage look like a real adventure, something out of, Jules Verne. So it's a paperback cover. And I think that this book, it does have a kind of legendary status. So perhaps not as an adventure story, but as the Smithsonian Magazine, writing about the Western Flyer in September 2019, said, it's an epic ocean voyage that would rewrite the rules of ecology. So that is what, in many ways, what it was, because John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts were friends. Steinbeck, of course, was a novelist and a well-known writer. Ed Ricketts was a marine biologist, but they were very close friends, and both of them used the term ecology in the 1930s when very few people were using the term. I think that my talk today focuses on communities and how they were both interested in communities. For Ricketts, interrelation, he said, was the keynote of modern holistic concepts, whereas the whole consists of the animal or the community in its environment, the notion of relation being significant. Now, this is one of the many, many statements he made about why ecology is so important, that you had to look at, for Ricketts, he looked at marine invertebrates, and you had to look at animals in relation to one another. You couldn't just study one animal, sea stars, for example, and understand the whole ecosystem. You had to look at their relation to other animals. And he pretty much spent his whole life doing that, studying communities. So I want to talk about not only this friendship between these two remarkable people, Ed Ricketts, scientist, Steinbeck, writer, but also add his wife to the mix, because she was as much a part of their community in Pacific Grove, California, as were the two men. Steinbeck and Carol were a unit. She edited all his works. She came up with titles for Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. She was the one who pushed him to write about California, what he knew, his home state, and she went along on the Sea of Cortez trip, although you might not know it from the text. She was on the voyage as well. So let me tell you a little bit about Carol first. She was born in San Jose in 1906, the year of the earthquake that hit San Jose, and her mother was so upset by the earthquake that she ran out of their house on 13th Street in San Jose and left the baby inside. So Carol always, I think, felt a little, uneasy about being left, maybe from that first experience. She graduated from San Jose High School, and her nickname was Husky. Her ambition, taking nourishment, her character ambition, as you see there, some of that's blocked with your pictures. But I think she was you could kind of tell that she was a kind of assertive person. She was very funny, very witty, very creative. She loved to read. She loved to laugh. She loved jokes. And the way that she and Steinbeck hooked up was in 1930. She went up to Lake Tahoe, where he was working in a fish hatchery. And over the door, he had piscatorial obstetrician. And she thought that was so funny that they laughed together and they hit it off immediately. They married, and in 1930 moved into this little house in Pacific Grove, a very simple board and batten house about 2 blocks from Monterey Bay. And they lived there together during his apprentice years from 1930 to 1936, when he was writing short stories collected in the Long Valley and Of Mice and Men and Tortilla Flat. He wrote those in this little house with her working outside the home to help make money to support them, and he writing every day. Here they are in that house. Steinbeck rolled his own cigarettes. He gave Carol a gun for one of their first Christmases together, which is a kind of appropriate gift for her. She was a kind of Annie Oakley character. So I think that, and I guess he thought she needed a gun. But theirs was a kind of companionate marriage. They were really good friends. They brought out the best in one another. She was funny. She loved to kind of do outrageous things. When they were first married, they lived briefly in Eagle Rock, and Carol drew pictures of their lives there together. And I think this kind of expresses very well her nature and her character. She drew a picture of all the women in the house. There were 3 couples living in a small house, and the women called themselves the Eagle Rock Self-Expression Society. They made beer, they had a cross-country hurdle race, they hung out in a nude bath in the backyard. They were just, did as many outrageous things as possible. So Carol was an artist. Her creativity was expressed in several ways. She drew these pink nude sportswomen in a series because she wanted to poke fun at the slim and svelte ideal of the day. So her women were always buxom and engaged in some kind of sports activity. She put these up all over the bathroom in their house in Pacific Grove. And Charlie Chaplin at one point visited. He became a friend of Steinbeck's as Steinbeck was writing The Grapes of Wrath in the late 1930s. And he thought these were so delightful that he wanted Carol to publish a book of her drawings. She never did, but they are funny. She also wrote poetry. And here's one of her poems, which does express a certain political view, which is pretty clear, which she also shared with her husband. I don't like Mr. Hearst, William Randolph Hearst this is. Mr. Hearst has no soul. I hope he falls down into a hole. I wouldn't touch Mr. Hearst with a 10-foot pole. He makes me sick. I've got no use for this cheap skater. I hope he breaks his neck on a potato and no one finds it out until 9 months later or never. Now, that's not a great poem, but it certainly clarifies a point of view. And it's a point of view that Carol and John shared. They very much cared about not the people that had money and power, but marginalized people, those who didn't have power. And it was actually Carol who really convinced John to become politically engaged in the late 1930s. He wouldn't have written The Grapes of Wrath without Carol. And it's dedicated to Carol, who willed this book. So they were very much in sync in terms of John's writing and his career. Now, here's the Monterey Bay and the peninsula. You can see Pacific Grove in the middle of this, and that's where John's house was. So John and Carol lived just a few blocks from where John's best friend, Ed Ricketts, lived. And he also met Ricketts in 1930, the same year he got married. They probably met at a party, although Steinbeck himself said that they met in a dentist office. I think it's an inside joke because Ricketts had terrible teeth. And so I think he's kind of goading his friend when he said they met in a dentist office, like that's where Ricketts should be, but wasn't. But they became instant friends because they like to talk about ideas. And I think, the book that I hope that you enjoy and that you'd like to read, Sea of Cortez, is really a book about ideas. And it really contains, in essence, their conversations, Steinbeck and Ricketts, and Carroll's too, throughout the 1930s. They would have let's get together and talk about ideas parties. So they would take, as Steinbeck says, take a piece of observed reality and break it off and then see where it took them philosophically in terms of ideas. And that was their great bond. This is Ricketts' lab, which is still there. Of course, it's closed now, but he had this little lab which extends out over Monterey Bay. And there he gathered marine invertebrates. His job was to gather marine invertebrates and other animals, frogs, and even cats. And he would sell them to laboratories around the country for dissection and study and biology courses. It wasn't a very profitable business, and he wasn't a great businessman, but little beasties, as he called them, invertebrates, were his first love. And his business bumped along for all the years he was in the peninsula from 1923 to 1948. Now, a lot of people were attracted to Ricketts. This is a very short talk, so I'm not going to say much about Ricketts and what a interesting man he was. Just briefly, he was a scientist, but he was also a philosopher. He studied Eastern religions. He was very much interested in ideas and poetry. He loved Gregorian chants and music. He was very interested in a kind of spiritual awareness, that ecology not only included animal communities, but included a larger whole that was spiritual and holistic and embraced an idea of how everyone is connected. People visited Ricketts' lab. He just drew people to him. Burgess Meredith was there after starring in Of Mice and Men. Joseph Campbell famously was there in 1932. They all came together, Ricketts, Joseph Campbell, and Steinbeck. Charlie Chaplin visited. Krishnamurti went up and down the West Coast and was a good friend of Ricketts. And later on in the 40s, Henry Miller. So he was a really intriguing man. He was a scientist and a man of ideas. Steinbeck said in the early 1930s, when he was writing his short stories, a book called To a God Unknown, and that a new eye is opening in the West. What he meant by that was a new way of seeing, seeing closely, seeing ecologically, seeing connections, noting that nature is important, not as something to conquer, but something that we should, humans should live in nature and consider themselves another species, one with the animals and the rocks and the trees. He said why they should ever been understood as separate, he did not know. And Ricketts' new eye opening in the West was his own study as a scientist, was really to study invertebrates. And he was one of the first to really write this handbook, which is still in print, about invertebrate communities. So, as I said, Ricketts came to the Monterey Peninsula in 1923 from Chicago. He didn't graduate from the University of Chicago, but came out to open this lab, his business. This is his very first catalog as a scientist. You can see him reaching out there for a sea star in Monterey Bay. And that's his early logo, which is great. Pacific Biological Laboratories with that octopus. And here are the close-ups of those pictures that Ricketts as collector. And in that first catalog, he makes an ecological statement. He said, there's a danger that you can over-collect. And he really wanted to warn people not to over-collect, but carefully replace animals after you'd examine them. Here's Steinbeck writing about his best friend, in a marvelous essay that is at the end of the log from the Sea of Cortez. And this kind of encapsulates who Ricketts was and why he was so extraordinary. No one who knew him would deny the force and the influence of Ed Ricketts. Everyone near him was deeply influenced by him, deeply and permanently. Some he taught how to think, others how to see or hear. Children on the beach, he taught how to look for beautiful animals in worlds they had not suspected were there at all. He taught everyone without seeming to. There's that new eye opening in the West, and that was Ed Ricketts. Now, when he first came to the peninsula in 1923, people would follow him around when he was collecting invertebrate animals in the intertidal. And as his wife said, he was married to a woman from Chicago. His wife said, when Ed saw how many people were interested in marine animals, he had thought of forming a field class for laymen. He had a letter written to be mailed to the Del Monte Hotel, which was the resort hotel built on the peninsula in 1880 with railroad money. So he had the letter mailed to the Del Monte Hotel to get it started from there. People would follow him around. He'd explain to them what the animals were and how they existed. And that's the germ of what became Between Pacific Tides, which was published in 1939, right before Ricketts and Steinbeck left for the Sea of Cortez. It was sort of his magnum opus. It talked about intertidal animals, but it talked about, the most important fact about this book is it talks about intertidal animals in terms of their communities, rocky shores, wharf pilings, etc., not in terms of individual species or scientific classification, class, phyla, etc. So it was groundbreaking in many ways. And as Ricketts said about it, the ecological arrangement has entailed not only considerable clerical difficulty, but has necessitated a great amount of field work, most of which could be obviated if the traditional method had been used. The attempt throughout has been to construct an account interesting to the lay reader and useful to the zoologist. So this collaboration between Ricketts and Steinbeck, I think, is really unusual and it's very significant. You have a scientist and a writer as best friends, and you have them thinking in similar ways. And it had a profound influence on the work of both. This is by a local artist who is enrolled in the scientific illustration program at CSUMB. But just briefly, on the left-hand side are Ricketts' concerns throughout life. On the right-hand side, Steinbeck. But, ecological sensibility, Steinbeck always wrote about living in place. Think about the Salinas Valley, Cannery Row, Tortilla Flat. All of his book titles are about place. Ricketts is interested in communal organization. Think about the Grapes of Wrath and the Jodes. It's about movement from I to we. Ricketts' term non-teleological thinking means look at what is, focus on what is actually there. Steinbeck had the same idea. He wanted to really have a kind of focus on just what happens, that nobody's to blame for what happens to Lenny and George and Of Mice and Men. The first title was Something That Happens. Ricketts wrote about 4 levels of ecology. He thought that ecology became increasingly complex if you understood it, and Steinbeck had layers in his prose. Ricketts talks about animals on the outer shores that survive wave shock. Steinbeck was interested in survivability. Ricketts' holistic sensibilities are mirrored in the books that both they wrote together, Sea of Cortez, and in Cannery Row, where Ricketts is the main character. So they really did intersect their minds and their ideas. Now, I'm not going to talk about Grapes of Wrath, but Steinbeck finished this book in 1939. So both Ricketts and Steinbeck finished their magnum opus right before they decided to go to Sea of Cortez. And Steinbeck, after he'd written this book about the great movement of humanity coming from Oklahoma to California, dispossession, homelessness, he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to write that anymore. Much to his editor's dismay, he said, I'm going to start working with other species beside the human. That's why my interest in biology and ecology have become so sharpened. The bioecological pattern having as its conception base an immeasurable lengthened time sequence does not admit the emphasis of such crises as human unemployment, except insofar as they vitally threaten the existence of the species. Do you see how Steinbeck's lens shifts when he decides he's going to go to the Sea of Cortez in this wooden boat that he charters to go to the Sea of Cortez? He doesn't want to talk about social problems of humans anymore. That seems small in relation to, biological and ecological patterns. So basically in late 1939, in November 1939, Ricketts and Steinbeck decide they're going to go to the Sea of Cortez and collect marine invertebrates. It's been a dream of Ricketts for a long time. Steinbeck has a lot of money after publishing The Grapes of Wrath and selling it to the movie version of The Grapes of Wrath. So he charters this boat, the Western Flyer, which is now restored and sitting in Port Townsend, of course. And they decide they're going to sail down to the Sea of Cortez. Initially, they were going to drive. They changed to chartering this boat. And they had the idea in November and they left in March. So it was a hastily planned trip. And their idea was we wanted to see everything our eyes would accommodate. Again, that sense of a vision, seeing in a new way. Ricketts called it a modern odyssey. They really thought they were going to do something significant and groundbreaking together. And here's the cover of the book they published together as co-authors in 1941. And it's about this 1940 trip on the Western Flyer to the Sea of Cortez. Now, what's really important about this? There's so many things to say about Sea of Cortez, and I'm not going to, this is shorthand really about the significance of this book. But in terms of the 4 levels of ecology that Ricketts was concerned with, really the book kind of celebrates, first of all, this first level of ecology. You have to look carefully, you have to see, you have to catalog the beasts of a given region. You have to look at the environmental factors that shape communities. And that's really what Ricketts and Steinbeck were doing in the Sea of Cortez. And that activity, level 1 of ecological study, grounds the book. Throughout, there are descriptions of intertidal animals. And really what they did every day was go and look in the intertidal and collect animals in the intertidal and look for the abundance of animals. The whole time, Carol was there too. She was a great collector. I did interview Captain Barry, who was the captain of the boat when he was in his 90s. And she said she was good on the trip, 75% well-behaved. I love that. Not 100%, but 75. And John himself said that Carol's beginning to be homesick for her garden near the end of the trip, but she's been marvelous on this trip. I don't know any other woman who could have done it. And she said, it was the happiest time of my entire life. So although she's not mentioned in the book, she was there. She was there in the conversations. She was there in the collecting. She was a part of the Ricketts Steinbeck team on this trip. And so a lot of these comments that are so characteristic of the book Sea of Cortez, I think are partly her thinking as well. A man builds the best of himself into a boat, builds many of the unconscious memories of his ancestors. The idea that a boat, you go to the deck and talk, and that's what they did every night. You can't stay down in the hold of the Western Flyer. They were all drawn to the deck. And that would have been Carol too. A man building his greatest and most personal of all tools has in turn received a boat-shaped mind, and the boat, a man-shaped soul. His spirit and the tendrils of his feeling are so deep in a boat that the identification is complete. And there's John Gregg, owner of the Western Flyer, who's been restoring it. And he certainly has a boat-shaped mind and a boat-shaped soul. I think as did Carol, Steinbeck, and Ricketts. Here they are on the boat. Notice Carol's there too, with the crew and a Mexican fisherman. Carol's on the baby flyer when they go out collecting. There she is in a striped shirt. I'm sure she wanted to look like a sailor. And then Steinbeck, of course, writes about, and humorously, of the other character on this little skiff, the Hansen Sea Cow, the engine kept malfunctioning. It was not only a living thing, but a mean, irritable, contemptible, vengeful, mischievous, hateful thing. The humor in the book. So as I said, they went collecting every day. I love this one quotation. There was an exuberant fierceness in the literal here, a vital competition for existence. And so that sense of life in the intertidal was fascinating to all of them. And the book is, again, punctuated with the marine animals they found. And Carol, John, and Ed were all involved in this process of collecting heliaster, snails, pencil urchins, etc. And the movement in Sea of Cortez is from that collecting, that seeing closely, that level one of ecology, to this abstract philosophical cast of mind that was so much a part of Ricketts' personality. And as they say, and perhaps a man looking at reality brings his own limitations to the world. If he has strength and energy of mind, the tide pool stretches both ways, digs back to the electrons and leaps space to the universe and fights out of the moment into non-conceptual time. Then ecology has a synonym for all. And that's really holistic ecology, deep ecology. And that's really what the book is also doing. It's not just about collecting invertebrates, it's how we have this flexible mind that can embrace all and see connections in all of nature. So that's where I will end, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Does anyone have any questions for Susan? Thank you so much. I could listen to you talk for hours.
Oh, thank you. I was trying to go lickety split.
So, well, while people are typing in their questions, one of the things I read about you, Susan, was that you've studied them for 27 years and you've never tired of the man or the writer. And I can tell that in your voice, you sound fascinated, but tell me how you got started studying Steinbeck.
I was actually an instructor at San Jose State University, and I had just moved to California, and a female chair said, "Would you like to be director of the Steinbeck Center?" Well, I'd gotten my PhD in North Carolina, so we hadn't studied Steinbeck. I knew nothing about how to be a director. I had no idea how to write a grant or organize a conference or, edit a newsletter. And I started doing all four of them at once because the provost of the university said she would close the center if I didn't, do something to make it more vital. So I was, inspired by that. And then I just, Steinbeck really made me love California. I grew up in Colorado, but he introduced me to the beauties of the state and the complexities of California. And why do I never tire of him? Because he was an amazingly curious man and was involved not only in ecological studies, but politics. He traveled a lot. He went to Russia after World War II. To read about Steinbeck is to read about, in many ways, about the history of the 20th century. So he was very engaged.
That's great. And so the whole trip was only 6 weeks, is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And where did they leave from?
Monterey.
From Monterey.
Yeah. They left from Monterey. John and Carol's marriage was a little rocky at the time because he was exhausted from the writing of The Grapes of Wrath, and he'd met another younger woman who eventually married. So they were a little rocky. But the trip brought them together, I think, at least temporarily. They did separate afterwards. He did write Sea of Cortez without Carol's input. But that trip was a kind of oasis for all three of them, certainly. I think they were very close on board the Western Flyer.
Were you around when is it John Glenn, the owner? Is that right?
John Gregg.
John Gregg. Were you around when that idea to resurrect the boat was percolated? That had to be a tremendously exciting time for people at the Steinbeck.
John Gregg, I think the idea was percolating in his head for many, many years, certainly before I ever met him. And he read Sea of Cortez when he was very young. He says at age 9, and that's amazing to read Sea of Cortez at that young an age. But he loved the book and loved the idea. And so he was kind of in the background, interested in Steinbeck without, he's a very modest person. And so he wouldn't, you know, I don't think he would brag about wanting to buy the boat. So he bought it, and then we met him. And it was a kind of, I mean, a boat that has been at the bottom of the sea 3 times is perhaps not the boat you want to buy, but it was a purchase of love. So that's why he bought it.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, is there any other questions for Susan before we move on? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Susan. We will ask more questions at the end, so no problem there. And I'm going to unpin you and pin myself. Okay, and now I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you the movie, The Western Flyer. Sorry, this will just take a second.
Western Flyer was built in 1937 in Tacoma, Washington at the Western Boat Building Company. And the Pacific Northwest had a lot of shipwrights. We had the wood, the materials, and they were turning out these boats like pickup trucks. In the 1930s, Monterey, California was a fishing hub, and the target fish was the Pacific sardine. The Western Flyer was built specifically for that sardine fishery, and that really what made Cannery Row in Monterey, California such a hub. The shipyard actually built 4 boats that year, all headed to Monterey. So it really had a very specific style and design. It participated in that fishery well into the 1940s. But as that fishery collapsed, it came back north and it began fishing off the Washington coast, targeting different fisheries along the Washington coast, and actually all the way up and around into Southeast Alaska. And by the 2000s, it kind of started to fall in disrepair. It had had some hard times before that, but really the hard times we all think about was in 2013, it sank.
John Steinbeck's The Western Flyer sank over the weekend again.
The Western Flyer has sunk twice in the past 3 months, and now the U.S. Coast Guard says the boat is incapable of floating again and needs to be taken out of the water.
This land developer owned the boat at this point, and on his watch, the boat actually sank tied to the dock 2 times back to back. And that's really when people think of the damage that we're currently dealing with the Western Flyer. The first time it was underwater for about a week, and the second time it was underwater for almost 6 months. It was raised and it was brought to Port Townsend in 2014. It sat out on dry land behind the shipyard, kind of where it's at currently. And it kind of was in that fate unknown. And there were several different articles, one in the New York Times. It was kind of in the genre of, literary icon, fate unknown. And at that point, that's when the group that owns it now stepped in and purchased it. So the Western Flyer Foundation vision was to restore the boat to a moment in time. And really our moment in time is the spring of 1940. In March of 1940, John Steinbeck and his best friend, Ed Ricketts, a marine ecologist, they wanted to take a trip together. They first were going to drive to the Sea of Cortez, and they later realized that a boat was the best way to see the areas they wanted to go to. They traveled from Monterey, California to the tip of Baja Peninsula and up into the Sea of Cortez, making several stops along the way.
He said that they have trouble finding a fishing boat that would take them to the Sea of Cortez. But Tony Berry said, I'll take you. And so they chartered that boat, the Western Flyer. It was one of Ricketts' dreams to catalog all the invertebrate animals on the West Coast, really from Sitka, Alaska to Baja. After Steinbeck had published his seminal novel, The Grapes of Wrath. And Ricketts had published his seminal work, which was Between Pacific Tides. So they'd each finished major projects, and Steinbeck had money, and he said, okay, let's do this. Let's together go to the Sea of Cortez and fulfill your dream and collect marine invertebrates. Steinbeck was born in 1902 in Salinas, which is inland. It's an agricultural town, and it's probably one of the richest agricultural regions in California. But his family also had a summer home in Pacific Grove on the Monterey Peninsula. And then in 1930, when he was 28, he moved back to the family summer home because he didn't have any money. He was determined to be a writer and to make his living as a writer. During those apprentice years in Monterey, he would spend a lot of time with Ed Ricketts. Ed Ricketts lived about a mile away from Steinbeck along the Monterey Bay. They met at a party, and they were just soulmates. They really sparked one another to think in creative ways. They both admired one another's strengths. Ricketts thought Steinbeck was a great writer, and Steinbeck really appreciated Ricketts' very kind of eclectic mind. He was a marine biologist and collected marine invertebrates and sold them to laboratories and scientific classrooms around the country. And so Steinbeck admired his profession. So it was really a friendship of equals and brought out the best in one another.
The entire experience with John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts was only 6.5 weeks long. The John Steinbeck era is a very short period of time, and what came out of it were these co-authored books, The Sea of Cortez, and then later The Log from the Sea of Cortez by John Steinbeck.
Ricketts was able to catalog many, many new species and to pick up and look at sort of the common invertebrates in the Sea of Cortez. So it was a kind of baseline survey of the Gulf of California, which was important. But in Steinbeck's writing it up, what the book is a kind of compendium of all their ideas that they discussed and shared throughout the 30s.
Same one.
The friendship is what it is, that book, Sea of Cortez. One reviewer said there's more of Steinbeck the man in this book than in any other.
The very first big challenge of the Western Flyer was getting it into the building it currently is in. Once the boat was in and out of the weather, really kind of the first phase of the project started. It was kind of an archaeological dig. It was sifting down through years of neglect, years of additional things being put on boats. You know, maybe some of the bulwarks had been removed and aluminum had been added to that. It had had different engines, different electrical systems. And on top of all that, it sunk 3.5 times. So sifting through all the layers of 80 years of history, restore Western Flyer to spring 1940. That's a clear objective and goal. But our foundation goes way beyond that. The Sea of Cortez trip really was the dawn of modern marine ecology, looking at the world as a working organism in a marine environment. You know, we have an element of research and education with the idea of restoring it to a working research platform, carrying on that legacy of Ed Ricketts and what John Steinbeck wrote about. It's understanding your world that you live in. You know, the world that Ed Ricketts lived in was the near tidal of Monterey, California. He got down in the tide pools, he flipped over those rocks, and he started to discover his world. And he wrote about that world. And that's the legacy that we're looking for. It's getting young people back into their environment, get them out on the water, have them dive a little bit deeper. Don't tell them how to understand our environment or how to solve our future environmental problems. Let them discover it and let those ideas flourish. We're a place for discovery and learning more than straight educating. You know, Ed Ricketts learned about the marine environment on his own. He was a dropout of University of Chicago, and he moved to California, and he literally started flipping over rocks, and he's a legend in the marine ecology world. So people ask me that a lot. What would Steinbeck or what would Ricketts think of this project? I think they would be, you know, thrilled to this project. You know, we're carrying on this legacy of discovering the world. And that's what Ed Ricketts was all about, was the discovery of our world. You know, his landmark book, Between Pacific Tides, is, I think it's the #1 longest pressed book at Stanford Press, and it's still standard freshman year marine biology in many universities. So his legacy is pretty broad, and he's an unsung hero in this.
I think what this trip did, because it was a trip taken by a scientist and a writer, is show the integration of science and scientific thinking and humanistic thinking. As a scientist, you look carefully, you participate, you look at group behavior, you look at colonial animals, etc. And that's kind of what Steinbeck was doing in his writing. He's looking specifically, he's looking at The Grapes of Wrath is full of details. He's looking at groups of people, the Jodes and migrations, and all of those are scientific principles as well. Survivability is a word that Ricketts used, is a word that Steinbeck used. So we want students really to understand this intersection between the scientist, which is a particular way of thinking and seeing the world and studying the world, and literature isn't necessarily separate, but they can be seen as together. I think that's what makes this unusual, because there are lots of boats and scientific vessels that go out, but this one is going to be not only the boat that Steinbeck and Ricketts took, writer and scientists, but really model programs on the way that their interactions took place.
The next real phase was establish the shape and the backbone of the boat, restore that original shape of the Western Flyer. There was some stationary molds put inside the boat to kind of help the project, to hold it together. And as we dug down into the boat, they found that there was more damage than was originally thought. You know, some of the damage and some of the rot had gotten pretty deep into some of the framing. But each move that was made along the way was very systematic to retain that original shape. You know, if you just removed all the parts and pieces that were bad on day one, you'd come back in the morning, there'd be a pile of rubble on the ground. So there was a system to each one of those moves. You know, when we started the project, we originally thought it would be about a 60-40, 60% new, 40% original. And now in the hull, as we dove deeper into the hull and found more decay and rot throughout that hull, it's really starting to be more like a 90-10. And really, it's about 95% new in the hull and 5% original. The keel and some of the backbone timbers. But the house, which was removed early on in February of 2019, is actually being restored almost completely to original. So it will be more like 90% original, 10% new. For the first few years of the project, I was still the head shipwright, the project manager for the shipyard. And in 2017, I'd really fallen in love with the project. So I stepped to the other side of the table. I left the shipyard. Now I'm the project manager for the Western Flyer Foundation. I had been doing hard shipwriting work for almost 30 years at that point. And this project, something grabbed a hold of me. There's a passion to this project. It's the people that come and see the project. We hauled that boat into the building it's currently in May of 2015. And within days of putting it into that location, there were people that were coming to see the boat, kind of almost that pilgrimage to see something that had a mark on their life. And I fell in love with that. And it was contagious. You know, I was seeing these people, some younger scientists, some later in life career scientists, just how much influence this man, Ed Ricketts, had meant on their life. And I think I just knew that I was a hold of something that was so much more than just a standard project.
I think people are just awestruck when they can be close to something that was actually a part of someone's life that they really respect and admire and emulate, or just want to, you know, acknowledge that writer or scientist has been an important part of their life. So I think the Western Flyer is such an iconic boat because the trip was so special and remarkable, and sends a chill down your spine when you can be at the places where an author or a writer or scientist was, or to see the boat. This is the actual boat that they took down to the Sea of Cortez. That's exciting. It's a project that brings people together, and I love that. People want to be a part of it.
Early on in the project, we started dismantling the boat. We realized we didn't know what we wanted to do with the wood, but we knew once it went to the landfill, it was gone forever. So we realized there was a place to help people to be part of this project on a grounder scale. So one of the partnerships that's kind of come out of this is Ventana Surfboards in Santa Cruz, California. They build hollow core rideable surfboards out of reclaimed recycled materials. I've been supplying Ventana with small pieces of the hull planking and some of the framing, and their head craftsman, Martine, has just turned them into pieces of art.
So we had come along some wood from John Steinbeck's first house in Pacific Grove. I was asked to speak at the Steinbeck Festival at the Steinbeck Center in Salinas, where Steinbeck was born. I met John Gregg, who was also speaking there, and he's the owner of the Western Flyer. And I just asked him, I said, hey, you think we could get some wood from the Flyer? And he said, absolutely. And they sailed it down to us from Port Townsend. And we had twice now we've done that. We've probably made 8 to 10 different boards that incorporate Western Flyer wood. We're trying to be the most environmentally responsible surf company in the world. And everything that we make has a really high bar for environmental and to some extent social responsibility. They generally are made from trash. A lot of reclaimed wood from all kinds of really cool historic sources like the Western Flyer. We've got 30 or 35 different partners that donate wood to us, and each piece of wood has a story that's much richer and more interesting than any new wood that you could buy.
There's going to be nails down the middle, boom, 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 boom. So when you get into milling, you're looking for metal. Yeah. But some of this color.
The Western Flyer wood specifically is, when we first got it, I mean, you can see on this piece, there's red paint on the outside and there's barnacles, and we thought it was trash wood. But then when you cut into it, Doug fir is usually really light. But it's because the wood that we first got from the hull was from the engine room. It's saturated in diesel fuel, so you can smell oil and diesel on it, but it comes out, makes the wood look like a rainbow. So it's special because it's got the history, but it's also special because it really, really looks unique when we use it in surfboards and other products.
The next big chapter would be framing the boat, really. The boat was built with 62 pairs of steam bent frames and 18 pairs of sawn shaped frames in the stern. Once that sawn frames were done in the stern, those steam bent frames were the next really big chapter. And putting those frames really defines the shape of the boat. That's going to be the permanent, lasting shape of the boat. You know, the Western Flyer had almost 18-foot long, 3-inch by 4-inch white oak frames. And those frames needed to be absolutely perfect. If anyone's steamed wood before, you know, you can't have any knots. We don't need any cracks. We can't have weird grain run out. Very few defects. So I searched for a long time for that wood. And I finally found it in Berea, Kentucky. We had it milled in Berea, Kentucky. That wood arrived in early 2019. And one of the most amazing parts of the project was they started the first frame on July 5th, 2019. They steamed and installed that frame. And almost 31 days later, I think it was 32 days later, they had all 62 pairs of frames in that boat. It was an incredible effort. You know, I would tell people on the street, make sure you get down there and watch that. It's a once in a lifetime experience, and you're going to miss out. It's just going to happen in a blink of an eye. And it truly did. So that was one of those moments. The boat went from, it made a big transformation for me of a project of you know, optimism and hope into this thing is really going to happen. Each one of the people involved in the project brings an incredible level of passion for what they're doing. Even the youngest shipwrights. There is something, you know, many of the tools we use are antique tools. Some might be almost 100 years old. There is a connection to the past, and I think we all really gravitate towards that. They're using old hand planes and old chisels and broad axes and adze. Those tools are all 100 years old, and it's not a nostalgia. There's nothing better. That tool does the job perfectly for what we need it to do. So it's a kind of an interesting relationship between the wood boat and the wood boat tool. You know, they haven't really gotten any better. Those tools that are pre-World War II, many of these bandsaws and joiners and table saws and hand planes and chisels are still the superior tool to do the job. back in 2015. One of the grandchildren of the original builder, Martin Petridge from the Western Boat Company, wanted to come up to Port Townsend and see the boat. And he came to the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op, and he gets out of his car, and the very first thing he says is, "I want to see the bandsaw." In 1981, when the Port Townsend Shipwrights was formed, it was a bunch of guys, and they didn't have any tools, and they had a little bit of cash, and they all threw a little bit of money in a hat, and they started looking for tools. The first big tool you need when you start a boat yard is a bandsaw. So they all threw a little bit of money in a hat, and they went to basically a going out of business sale at a place called the Western Boat Company. At this point in time, the Western Boat Company in the late 70s had finally gone completely out of business, and they were selling off the tools. And they bought this large ship's bandsaw, and it became a focal point of their business. They built a building around it. We cut thousands of miles of wood on this one particular bandsaw. And as this grandson of the builder starts telling me this story, that this bandsaw was probably built in 1910. The Western Boat Company built the Western Flyer in 1937. And it's the exact same bandsaw that built the Western Flyer. You know, every piece of wood that is cut today to go into the Western Flyer is cut on that very same bandsaw. It's still the same parts and pieces, the moving wheels, the blade turning, and it's pretty interesting connection back to the Western Flyer. And it's now almost become a theme. People, the first thing they want to say now is, "I want to see the bandsaw," and they want to hear that story for themselves about how this bandsaw has built the boat twice. There's something about that traditional construction method that speaks to certain people, crafting the materials, cutting and sawing and shaping. You know, each piece of wood that we put into a boat is shaped on all four sides and both ends. You know, there's nothing we put into a wood boat that can be bought at a store, at a Home Depot or a hardware store. You know, we buy a board that might be 20 inches wide, and we shape a board at the end that's 8 or 9 or 10 inches wide with a curve and a set and a bend and bevels. So there's something very gratifying about, you know, creating those beautiful lines of infinity, those shapes that really attract all of us to these boats. I think people just enjoy watching craftsmen do true things. You know, that was a famous thing that Ed Ricketts would say, is, you know, he liked true things. And I think there's something about the restoration that is a true thing. It's people crafting and shaping wood, an organic material, into a living object. You know, there's something really unique about the wood boat. The people that come to the festival, the people that come to be part of this industry. I was just speaking to someone earlier today that, you know, he's a 65-year-old retiree, and his words, "I wish I had moved here 35 years ago to be part of this." The next real big phase started in about November of 2019, and that would have been the replanking phase. There were a few hull planks in the boat that we probably could have saved, but we opted to go with 100% replank of the Western Flyer. So that means 100% of the planks came off and 100% went back on. And that was about 14,000 board feet of SIPO, which is the material we chose to use for that. It's an African mahogany. And that project really got started in December of 2019. The first planks went on the boat, and they ended up planking the entire boat in about 3 months with a crew of about 8 people consistently. So that really brought us up to where we are now. Our original timeline was to be out of the building and nearing the water by late 2020. And I think that's probably gotten pushed back to our new timeline, really is to be out of that building in early 21. You know, our ultimate goal is to get the boat restored, get these next phases done, and get back to the Sea of Cortez. You know, there's something about returning the boat to the Sea of Cortez, the scene of the crime, you know, where this legacy in this novel was written. In the shipwright world, we call the hull, deck, and house is about a third of a project completed. We still have mechanical, we have rigging, we have an entire classroom research facility, and an entire interior that we need to build into this boat. So there's a lot of chapters still to go in this restoration.
One of my favorite lines from all of Steinbeck is in the opening chapter of The Log from the Sea of Cortez. He says, "You break a small piece of coral off a coral reef, and that doesn't matter much to the intertidal. The Japanese shrimp boats are dredging the Sea of Cortez, taking up all the shrimps, and that doesn't matter very much to the world." And then he says, "Bombs are falling overseas and destroying cities, and that doesn't matter very much to the stars." And then he says, "Either all of it matters or none of it does." And that sense of ecological holism, that the smallest gesture can make an impact just as large, dramatic gestures, I think is something we really need to think about and hold in our minds today. And later on, he says, we need to look from the tide pool to the stars and back again. So you need to study things carefully, you need to look, you need to participate like the scientists, and we need to speculate like philosophers. We need both faculties of mind to be whole and to be human.
Okay, well, that was so great. I could watch that once a month. It's a really entertaining, so entertaining. So I'm going to bring Chris on here. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. If everybody caught that, Chris has been a shipwright for 30 years and was the part owner at the Shipwrights Co-op for 17 years. They call them members, but it's really kind of an ownership. And then he moved over and is now the project director at the Western Flyer Foundation. And I think you could all feel his passion for the project. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I hope everybody will pop some questions in there for Chris. Go ahead and ask him anything about the boat. In the meantime, Chris, thank you. And why don't you tell us what your give us an update on the Western Flyer.
Well, first off, thanks a lot for having me. It's nice to be able to get an update during this COVID time. I know there's a lot of eagerness to get down and see the boat, which we all know is difficult to do right now. But yeah, so I think an update, you know, when we saw in that video there, the last thing I really talked about was putting the hull planks on the boat, and the Shipwrights Co-op were busily doing that. That part of the project luckily finished right when COVID struck. So I think they hung the last planks in late March, and the shipyard did get shut down. So that's the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op in the middle of the boat haven there. Like all the businesses in Port Townsend, they took a leave from work. I think they were shut down for about 6, maybe 7 weeks. So that definitely changed the pace of the project and how the public can view the project, which is a bit of unfortunate for the public viewing, because people were really starting to get excited. I think, like I said in the video there, I told a lot of folks on the street to get down there. And the Port Townsend Shipwrights were very gracious during the pre-COVID era to allow visitors daily. That has changed, and I think there'll probably be some questions about that. When can they get back down there? Can they see the boat? But since the last that happened, so the project did get going again in probably about June. We started with a slow crew. The Port Townsend Shipwrights, Tim Lee and Pete Rust are the leads on the project, the Shipwrights Co-op. They brought back kind of a skeleton crew, cleaned up some of the loose ends of the planking. We all know you put hull planks on, there's a lot of loose ends. There's bunging and seam compounding, fairing the boat. But they were able to get some momentum through the summer. They continued on with the deck structure. So the deck structure on the Western Flyer, all the deck beams have been replaced with Douglas fir deck beams. They tidied up some of the loose ends on that and then proceeded into laying 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood. The covering boards on the outside edge is a solid stock. If people have questions about that, we can talk. But they laid the covering boards, the 2 layers of marine grade plywood, and then actually built the stacked lift bulwarks on top of that through most of the summer and into the fall of 2020. I think I say in the video we were hoping to be in the water by early 21. Clearly, COVID has changed that a little bit along the way. But like I said, they worked into the fall with the bulwarks. They had a bit of skeleton crew again, about 4 shipwrights working daily. A couple of other things, loose ends around the edges. But the last big thing that's been done on the project in 2020 was the entire hull did get corked. So corking, or caulking on the East Coast, some people call it, is the process of basically hardening up the entire hull, driving a band of cotton in there, a seam of cotton, and then 2 passes of oakum over the top of that. So all of that work was started in maybe mid-November and completed just before the first of the year. So as for COVID, things are still moving along with the project, definitely. Like I said, it is still a bit of a skeleton crew, 4 to 5 shipwrights. moving, in and out on what specialty is needed. They're currently working on the interior bulkheads. The ship has 6 main athwartship bulkheads that are framed out in yellow cedar, solid stock yellow cedar, and then covered in 2 layers of marine grade plywood on both sides for structural integrity. And you make those as watertight as you can, but they are definitely structural bulkheads. So things are still moving along. I'm sure there'll be some other questions along with this, but timeline-wise, viewing is probably going to be the #1 question. The shipyard is still 100% closed. They are definitely being very careful with their crew. I think they have almost 50 employees, and they don't want to take any risks exposing their employees to outside visitors. So they're very, very to the state protocol on allowing people to come and go, which is very limited to myself and a few other outside parts of, board members from the Western Flyer Foundation. So unfortunately for everyone who got so used to going down there daily, having lunch at the Blue Moose and then walking across and seeing the boat, your best chance to see updates is on a YouTube channel. So.
Well, great. Thank you. So yeah, that was one of the questions is Michael Heika asked, where did that go? That just disappeared. Where can they follow the boat? So tell them what your YouTube channel is. Can you hear me?
Right. So, yeah, a couple of years ago, I think it's almost been 2.5 years ago, I decided to give people an update, a visual update, because there are local folks that go down and see the boat. There are people in California, there are people around the world that want to know a little bit about what's happening on the Western Flyer. So I actually took it upon myself to start a YouTube channel, which was a new endeavor for me. Being a shipwright of 30 years and not on the camera side of things, I had to learn a little bit how to speak in front of a camera, how to edit, how to make a video. And that has blossomed into something. I think I've made maybe 40 update videos that can be seen on the Western Flyer channel. I try to get one up every 2 to 3 weeks. It's kind of spotlighting what's happening with the project. And most recently in the last couple of episodes that I've been doing, I've been trying to start to spotlight some of the stories that surround the Western Flyer project. So that's the best way to follow the project. If you're a local, you live on, here in Port Townsend and you want to see what's happening, or if you live in, England, Australia, there are actually people, it's amazing what the world of YouTube exposes a project like this to. Viewers around the world, people that want to chime in and be part of the story, get their update. A lot of the people are following it because of the Woodboat project, the construction. They're very interested in how boats go together. But quite a few people are actually interested in the humanities of the project, the art of the project, the science of the project. So I personally have been just excited to see how many people are following the project and what kind of audience that draws from around the world. But that is the best way to get updates on a regular basis.
Oh, you've done a beautiful job with that, Chris. I watch all of them. I just love them. And how many followers do you have on that website or on the YouTube site?
Oh, I think it's a little, I think I have about short a little 40,000 subscribers, which is good for what I'm doing. The way I present the information, it is a great avenue to see the project.
That's great. So we have a couple questions here. Michael Heika, I hope I said that right, asks, how did you determine what the boat was equipped and finished for your restoration date? Photos, question, journals. I'm not sure I understand that.
I'm guessing what he's probably getting at is how did we figure out how to restore the boat? Where do you start? What's the first piece of wood? I'm going to go out on a limb and think that's what his question is. How do you start a restoration of this scale?
And know what original.
There is a real.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
And know what original.
So,
yeah.
I know it original. So the Western Boat Company, which was in Tacoma, Washington, actually burned a couple of times. It wasn't uncommon for a shipyard during the 20th century to burn an oily rag stuffed in a corner or something mishapped. It did have one of those. It had several fires. So all the physical records of the boat were lost. The blueprints for the boat were lost. Any kind of construction details were lost. So what we had to go with was a set of blueprints that were to a very close sister ship, which have lended a hand for the construction. But all Pacific Northwest fish boats are built very similarly. They have the frames connect the same way to the keel. The backbone is designed the same way. The stern lifts are built. So there were clues along the way on the construction method. And obviously we had the boat in front of us. And lucky for us, very little had been altered on the boat since 1937. But there is a system on how to approach a restoration like this. You know, we did have a moment in time that we were looking at. We wanted to go back to that spring of 1940. I think if I remember, they left Monterey on March 15th, 1940 on this famed 6.5-week trip to the Sea of Cortez. And that's the moment in time we're looking for. So the very first thing I think the crew and myself and is to sift down through that boat. What has been added to the boat? What has been altered to the boat over the years? Really determine what you own. What are the backbone of the boat? And then start to create a restoration plan with that. You know, what desperately needs to be fixed? What's your A priority, B priority, like any major project. And then obviously make, you know, contingency plans along the way. But the actual first pieces of wood that went on the boat are also kind of in a systematic way. You know, you really need to establish this shape and preserve this shape. So there was a lot of care in again, replacing the board systematically. You know, it wasn't, again, I think I said in the video, if you just started randomly peeling wood off the boat, you would end up with a pile of rubble and that shape would be lost. So Tim and his crew spent a lot of time carefully, you know, measuring the boat. They actually patterned off one side, lofted that back out full size, replicated interior mold sections like you would in a new construction. So there was a lot of care. So to answer his question, I think his question is, how do you proceed? It's a dissection of what you have, and then going on the collective knowledge. And Port Townsend couldn't be a better place in the universe to do a project like this. With its base of knowledge here, that collective knowledge and a dissection of what you own is really where you proceed. So long answer.
No, that's beautiful, Chris. Thank you. You did that very well. So another question, Christina Wilkening asks, will the boat's port of call be Monterey?
The boat will be based out of Monterey. You know, with a project, you know, starting a new nonprofit, starting something, you know, growing this from its infancy into something, you kind of have to stand on the shoulders of something. And though our vision is from Sitka, Alaska to the Sea of Cortez, the near coastal of North America, that is a very broad range. And I think in those first early years, it really will be Monterey and south. But ever since my very first handshake with John Gregg back in the spring of 2015, his vision was always to go where it's needed. You know, if it is Sitka, Alaska, if it's Southeast Alaska, it's Port Townsend, Washington, it's Tacoma, Coos Bay, Oregon. If it's that community has a need for what we can provide, the boat will be part of that community. So I think his early vision, John's early vision was, yes, we'd be based in Monterey, California, but in alternating years. In 2024, it goes to Alaska. In 2025, it goes to Mexico. And so we can always be part of the communities we want to be part of. If anyone watching has been part of a nonprofit, that is a big ask for a boat that goes 8 miles an hour to service Sitka, Alaska to the Sea of Cortez. But, you know, with modern technology, I was just working today talking about how do you do ship to shore education? How do you set that up? And luckily we have some people on the advisory board, some people that are helping us out to learn, to weave through that unknown territory of, you know, how do you get a floating classroom that is in Santa Rosalia, Mexico, but it's communicating with Port Townsend's marine education program. So there's a lot of challenges, but long answer again. I hate to be, I'm terribly long-winded, but
great.
The boat will be home ported in Monterey, but it's a boat. Hopefully it's always on the move.
What'll be painted on the transom? Monterey or Port Townsend?
It could be Tacoma.
Ah, yeah.
You know, it's a, you know, technically it could be, yeah. I don't know. We'll have to, we'll wait.
Surprise. It'll be really,
it could be a surprise for all of us.
Yeah, I kind of like that. So Roger asks, why did the Western Flyer sink?
Which time?
Yeah.
This boat has sunk 3.5 times, and I like to emphasize the 3.5, just like I think we emphasize the 6.5-week trip to the Sea of Cortez. Something about that half draws you in. Of what is the half? Explain the half. So the half, it sank in 1964 in off of Montague Island in central Alaska, in the Gulf of Alaska. And at that point in time, they had built an aluminum tank. So John Steinbeck's life with the boat, again, was in the mid-1940s. Its relationship with the Monterey community lasted until the late 1940s. It continued to fish the rest of its life all up and down the coast. So here's this boat. It's out in the Gulf of Alaska. They had built an aluminum tank, and they had used the wrong welding rod to build the tank. And the tank actually ruptured, and the boat started to sink into the stern a little bit. The Coast Guard was able to get some pumps on board, 1960s, salvaged the boat. The second sinking of its life, or the full sinking, was it hit a rock in 1971 in Ketchikan, Alaska, just north of Ketchikan. Hit a rock, probably tending in Alaska. It was drug up onto a beach. It was salvaged. It didn't sink to the bottom. It was recovered. I'm not exactly sure if the work was done in Ketchikan. Most likely it was patched in Ketchikan, brought to Seattle and repaired. But the two most prominent sinkings that everyone thinks about were in the Twin Bridges and the Swinomish Channel, leaving the Anacortes onto the mainland, if you've gone over those Twin Bridges. And at that point in time, quick story is it was owned by a land developer. The last fisherman that owned the boat, a man named Ole Knudsen, had sold the boat. This was 2013. He sold the boat to a land developer who was based out of Salinas, had a vision to have the Western Flyer as part of his hotel. You could come aboard, have a cocktail, drink aboard the Western Flyer, be part of history, but it would be a land-based object. He didn't really know much about restorations, wooden boats, didn't know a thing about it. The fisherman walked off the boat. He went back to Salinas, California, and literally the boat sank tied to the dock there under the Swinomish Channel, under the Twin Bridges. Most likely it was a bilge pump slowed, failed. You know, boats, you know, they always leak a little bit, but so imagine rainwater getting in, the deck is starting to fail, you're getting some water in, a bilge pump stops in the middle of the night, the boat sinks a little deeper in the water, and those first topside seams are exposed to fresh water. They are dry, they let a little more water, and it's just rinse and repeat until it's on the bottom. It sank literally tied to the dock. The DNR came, they raised the boat, they tied it back to the dock, and it literally the exact same thing happened several weeks later, and it sank again tied to the dock. This time it actually sank into the mud of the Swinomish Channel and rolled over onto its side. It rolled onto the port side of the boat with the starboard side up, and it sat there for quite some time until they raised it as a navigational hazard. So I hope that answers his question.
That's great.
Neglect is why it sank.
Raised it and brought it to Port Townsend that first time, that wasn't John Gregg that did that. It was just because it was a hazard and they had to get it out of the channel.
Exactly. So the boat was brought to Port Townsend. I think it was the fall of 2013, and it arrived in town. At that point, this developer from Salinas owned it. The Department of Natural Resources was involved as a derelict boat restoration. They brought it to Port Townsend. It was the nearest port they could haul that boat out of the water. And it sat back behind the Port Townsend Shipwrights Co-op for 2 years, 18 months plus, until this very fateful, you know, life is such about fate. As Susan said, John read that book as a very young man, and it put him on this life journey of discovery and observation of the world, where he stumbles across this boat. There was an article written in the New York Times about the, literary icon, fate unknown type article. And a good friend of John Gregg's actually forwarded him the article and said, "Hey, John, that boat you've been looking for is right here." And John came up and bought it a few weeks later. So it was, and that was in the spring of 2015. So just about now, 6 years ago. I won't tell John that, but it's been 6 years.
Yeah, well, we're so grateful that he took that on. So there are a couple more questions here. Bob Keller from Mexico on the shore of the Sea of Cortez. Are there any scheduled is there a schedule of trips back to the Sea of Cortez when finished? And I know you said there was, but do you have any idea of timeline of when that might happen?
You know, it was that dang COVID thing. You know, this time last year, we were actively, I had been meeting with a group several times about having a shadow ship. Our target and our window is still the spring of 2021 or 2022. And at that point, about a year ago now, 12 months ago today, I would have been working with a group to provide a shadow ship. Our objective, our goal was to be in the Sea of Cortez in the February, March, April, May season. And we would actually have this shadow ship that supporters of the project would be able to, you know, buy passage on. We would have 4 to 6 consecutive weeks. So yes, there was a very robust plan in the works that COVID stubbed our toe on. And that will still happen. You know, there's still a lot of support worldwide, particularly North America, but worldwide, that wants to be part of the boat. They want to be somehow engaged with the boat once it goes to the Sea of Cortez. It is only 77 feet long. It's not going to be carrying 100 passengers. So this concept of a shadow ship was always in the works, that maybe 50 or 60 passengers would be able to be near the Western Flyer. We would have different guest speakers throughout the cruise season. So that was the idea, if that answers Bob's question. We are still pointing our arrows at the spring of 22 at this point.
Okay. So Paul Silverman asks, do you intend to finish her to working boat standards, or will you do more to finish her?
We have stepped way beyond the working boat standards. So in 1937, you know, wood boat construction was at its peak. It was the apex of design and execution. It never really got much better. The one thing that we've been able to do in the 21st century is to use a little bit better materials. In the 1937, it was built with iron nails, which worked great. It had a window of operation. That boat was probably built for a 10 to 15, maybe 20-year working cycle, and they would have discarded it. They probably envisioned that boat as a 10-year lifespan, not a 82-year lifespan. So some of the materials, the way iron reacts with oak, reacts with Douglas fir, gave it some trouble. So his question is, will we repair and restore beyond commercial construction? We've opted to use bronze screws, bronze backbone bolts, superior grade material for the hull planking. A lot of Purple Heart was introduced into some of the bulwark construction, the stern lifts. So actually, it's odd, you know, in this 21st century, materials are quite expensive, but they're still cheaper than labor. So it is behoove us to use a much higher grade material than they had. They had it available in 1937, but they wouldn't have wasted bronze or a tropical hardwood on a fish boat with a life expectancy of 10 years. Whereas we're looking way into the future, labor, expense, doing this again. The Western Flyer could live easily another 100 years with the work that's being done at the Shipwrights Co-op. The Purple Heart, the bronze particularly. Bronze is an amazing material in salt water compared to iron. So will it be finished above and beyond commercial grade? Much beyond that, yeah. But it's visual, if that was part of his question. Visually, when you step back from the Flyer from 100 feet, it'll feel very much like 1940. It'll look like the spring of 1940. So visually, we've kept it as original as possible and still be a functioning boat and function how we want it to function. That's great.
This next question is, I think you answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's, I think you can expound on it. Michael Heike again asked, how difficult has it been to find wood and materials to restore the boat to the spring of 1940 state? And I ask it again because the story behind some of the wood you found was just so amazing.
It is a huge challenge in any restoration. If it's this restoration, if it's some of the other ones going on around the country, if it's just repairing your boat here in Port Townsend or wherever you live, material acquisition is a huge part of a project. You know, wood doesn't grow on trees anymore. It can be really difficult to find some of the sizes. You know, it's easy to find wood for a 22-foot sailboat or a 32-foot sailboat, something that's an inch thick, an inch and a half thick. But when we start working on the scale of the Western Flyer and a little bit bigger, it's large scale timbers. It's timbers that are 8 by 30 inches by 20 feet. It's big pieces of wood. And that timber has been really difficult to find. Luckily, Port Townsend is blessed again as the epicenter of wood boats, and that can't be undersaid without Edensaw Woods. Jim Ferris, Kiwi at Edensaw Woods, supplies this part of the country and the rest of the world with wood. So he's been a great partner in the project, but it has been a search. And then you're also weighing a lot of environmental concerns. We early on looked at Alaskan yellow cedar as a potential major species used in the restoration. And that, we were looking at 800, 900,000-year-old trees. And how did we justify that? How does it work? How does it feel? So yeah, there was some challenges. It's when you start getting into wood this thick, the hull planking is a full 2 inches thick on the Flyer. We started with a 2 3/8 inch thick material that shrank 2 1/4 surface to the 2 inches we needed. So it's a large scantling material used. So yeah, the acquisition of any project is a huge part of it. I think there are about 30,000 number 20 by 4 bronze screws in the hull. It's not hard to find, but you need to plan ahead. They don't build wood boats like this. So again, you just don't get it at the hardware store. But again, we have a community that is blessed with, unbelievable resources and talent and depth. And everything's possible. Finding the oak was one of the biggest challenges of the project. Early on, I thought, we just need to get some oak to reframe the boat. We'll call Edensaw, Kiwi will find the wood. And the immediate challenge was finding 18-foot long boards. It wasn't finding the 3 inch by 4 inch wood. It was finding wood long enough, clean enough, and clear enough to bend into the Flyer. And it was due to the changing mechanization of the lumber industry. Everything in the forest industry is for maximum yield for good purposes. And the wood we buy is 4 feet and 8 feet. So I could find 16, but I couldn't find 18. So it presented this huge challenge. And, I'm what better person for a challenge. I literally got on the telephone and I got on the internet. I Googled sawmills in the Ohio Valley. I said, isn't the entire Ohio Valley one giant oak tree? And I started calling sawmills and they said, we can't help you, but call this guy. He can't help me. And about maybe 30 or 40 phone calls down the road of who could help me, I ran across a man, and it led me to Berea College. That just turned out to be one of the greatest experiences of the entire project for me. It's a whole side story we could dive into, but it was Susan joined me on a trip to Berea, Kentucky.
Right.
We watched some trees fall. We enjoyed some horse logging. We enjoyed some just wonderful stewardship of the environment and their world. It was really a great experience.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's great. So we have another question from Valerie Arntzen. Would it be in the Port Townsend Wooden Boat Festival in 2021 or 2022? Isn't that the question of the hour?
I think Barb actually wrote this question. It is very possible it will be in Port Townsend in the fall of 2021. And that will be the year, if we want to utilize it as part of the festival, this will have to be the year. 18 months from now, which would be the fall of 22, it will definitely be out of the community. It will be down the coast and gone. That said, when the boat actually touches water, I think it will have its own festival. I'm sorry, Barb. And the Maritime Center will be part of that festival, but I have some sneaking suspicion it might generate 500 to 1,000 people all by itself. It is shocking the amount of people worldwide, again, that seek this project out. I get an email every day asking, when is it going in the water? When can we come see it? When can we be part of it? So I think that day it touches the water, we'll just have a festival.
Yeah. And that'll certainly be in the summer when hopefully COVID's a little further behind us, where we can put everybody in town.
Right. Yeah, I would love to see that. I have my own personal selfish vision of what that could look like, both the festival here in Port Townsend, But there is some merit in taking the boat back to the Theophos waterway and giving a little tip of the hat to the Petridge family and the community of Tacoma that did so much in the conception of this boat and the entire Northwest fishing fleet. So I think there is something to, maybe a little something in Port Townsend, maybe a little something in Tacoma as a thank you to the community. And then obviously when it hits the dock in Monterey, I certainly hope the entire peninsula of Monterey comes down to see their beloved Western Flyer return.
Well, I'm sure, I mean, they will be celebrating this around the world. It's been so fun to get to know that boat Tacoma that's in Australia, where they sent the plans from the Western Boat Company over to Australia, and those guys built a mini Western Flyer. Yeah, I mean, it's been incredible to watch those stories come together. We will definitely be celebrating you at the Wooden Boat Festival this year in whatever capacity we can have festival, for sure.
I certainly hope in some capacity you can be part of it. Again, Port Townsend has been very receptive to the project, a lot of community support. There's a lot of fans out there that it would be a shame to just splash hit the water and drive away. So
yeah, that would be, I don't think you'd be allowed to do that.
Barb, can I answer Christina's question?
I don't see it. Absolutely.
About the original marine collections from the Sea of Cortez, because that's an interesting question. And actually, Ricketts, the animals that he wasn't able to identify, he sent to the Smithsonian. And so the Smithsonian has quite a large collection of Ricketts specimens. And they may, at some point, come to Monterey or be a part of a small museum that we could establish for the Western Flyer. The rest of the specimens went to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. So they're actually not in Monterey, but they're in, in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. But that's a really interesting question. So wish they were lining the walls of Ricketts Lab, but they're not right now.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that question had slipped too far forward on my iPad. I couldn't see it anymore.
Oh, so that's fine. No, that's fine. I was just reading them and I thought that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you. And then there's a couple more. Paul Silverman asked, did you have to scarf any of the planking?
No, that's not a technique that we use in carvel planking of this scale. It is common in smaller boats. He obviously knows what he's talking about, where you might scarf a plank. In heavy construction like this, we actually we butt the planks on the frame. The frame is a large enough landing surface that the two ends of the plank can actually land on one frame. And we were lucky with the wood that Kiwi at Edensaw supplied. We bought whole trees and then had them custom sawn to our specifications. So the shipyard had wood up to 39 feet long. So when Tim and Pete created a planking schedule for the Flyer, they were able to scatter the butt platter. It's called the butt blocks, or the butts of the planks. They were able to spread those out sufficiently for safety. But that's a pretty rare thing. Back to the gentleman who asked about wood acquisition, being able to work with a 39-foot board is quite a treat, to be able to spread that out. So no, we did not scarf any of the planking. It was all just traditionally butted on the butt blocks, on frames, not butt blocks.
Great. Okay, one more quick question. Paul asks again, modern electronics navigation, are they hidden away or redo originals?
It's a good question. It's a great question. The boat, again, from 100 feet away, it should look like 1940. Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck will feel like they're walking up to the Western Flyer. That might stop when you step aboard the boat. When you're moving through the galley, you're moving through the crew quarters above deck in the house, it will very much feel like 1940 as if Steinbeck was on it. But the mission of the Western Flyer Foundation is to use this boat, is to move this boat. It's not a stagnant museum. It's not going to be tied to the dock for historic relevance and historic correctness. So no, there will be a mast somewhere on there. We're going to have to put a radar on it. But do the best you can to hide that. Antennas, obviously, it'll have a Christmas tree of antennas on the top. You try to hide that as much as possible, but at some point, you're going to have to blend the 21st century with the 20th century on this project. So it is a fine line. It was the very first question I might have asked John is, are we hiding the radios? Are we hiding the radar screens? And I don't think they'll be out there blaring as if we're on the Starship Enterprise, but they will be part of it. And when you move down into the boat, it will feel like a 1940s laboratory, but we're asking this boat to house an ROV, a remote operated vehicle. We're asking it to have quite a lot of high-tech scientific equipment and freezers on board, a lot of collecting specimen equipment aboard the boat. So we're asking it to be a laboratory, and that's going to be, blinking lights, flashing lights. It's going to be computer screens set in a 1940s feel. So Steinbeck will be scratching his head as what that ROV thing is, but he'll enjoy driving it.
That's great. Okay, and then Susan, one for you. Is Ricketts Lab a museum now, or is it just locked up?
Well, right now it's locked up during COVID, but it's owned by the city of Monterey. So it's kind of an interesting history of the lab, because when Ricketts died in 1948, it eventually fell into the hands of a group of businessmen in Monterey, and they bought it as kind of a party place. And every Wednesday they would have a party there. And they kept it basically throughout the second half of the 20th century, and finally sold it mid-90s to the city of Monterey because they want it preserved. So they wanted it preserved. So they sold it for about, I don't know, it was like $300,000, which was, not much for the property on the bay. And so the city owns it and opens it Saturdays for tours. They don't charge. You can go through tours. You can, go through historical tours in the lab. And the Cannery Row Foundation, which is another group in Monterey, also gives tours, different kind of tours. So it's open, but, it's a fragile building. You can't have a lot of people go through it. It is kind of a museum because it looks like it did when that men's group was there, and they helped found the Monterey Jazz Festival. So a lot of jazz posters, and there were some cartoonists, one of whom was the Dennis the Menace cartoonist, Frank Ketchum, was one of the members of the lab. So there's cartoons around the lab. So it's kind of a museum. In the basement, it has some Ricketts memorabilia, as the desk he took on the Sea of Cortez trip, and it has a few specimens, and it has some letters. So, but it's dark down there and definitely needs to be restored. So I wouldn't elevate it with the term museum, but it's one of those places that hasn't changed much. So to go through it is really, people love going in the lab because it's the real place where Ricketts was, and it looks pretty much as it did when Ricketts was there and lived there. So anyway, that's what it.
Thank you guys so much for being here. This was so much fun and so educational and entertaining. I hope everybody got their questions answered. And
I did see a question. What was Steinbeck's favorite book? Someone asked. Maybe Susan could answer that real quick.
It's on any other favorite Steinbeck book recommendations. I don't know. Actually, Steinbeck's favorite book of all that he wrote, he said, was Sea of Cortez, which is an interesting response. My favorites are, I love Cannery Row. Every time I read Of Mice and Men, I think that's an amazing little book. I wrote a book on Grapes of Wrath, so I think that's wonderful. And if you really want to understand ecology and Steinbeck's ecological vision, read To a God Unknown, which was very influenced by Joseph Campbell and Steinbeck, Joseph Campbell and Ricketts talking together, and all of them reading the poetry of Robinson Jeffers. So it's a really interesting book about living in place.
That's fantastic. And Susan, your books are available on Amazon, you said, is the best place to actually get those?
Amazon, or your local bookstores, and order them. So I mean, they're probably not stocked in a lot of places, but they would be available through the local bookstores or on Amazon, or Powell's Books in Portland.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, you guys. Chris and Susan, really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us. And we're so excited about the project. I'm more fired up than ever. Yeah, I can't wait to see it hit the water.
Let me just add one comment that Steinbeck's first published work was in the high school yearbook, and it was about the need for a wood shops in high schools. So, and he was actually a wood carver himself. So for all of you wooden boat enthusiasts, Steinbeck loved wood. He thought that, you know, young boys should be able to take wood shop, and he carved throughout his life. He made various signs and little things out of wood. So,
oh, that's fascinating. That's wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Greatly appreciate it. And we will be watching you on YouTube. We'll be watching your progress.
Thank you.
yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Good night.
Barb. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Barb.